Thank you very much for your stamina in keeping going in this really quite intellectually arduous conference. As in the previous 2 days, we're now going to have a panel discussion relating to the topics that have been discussed in the concurrent session that went before. And on this occasion, we have one representative from each of those sessions. One person who is listed in the program as participating now, unfortunately, had to go and catch a flight. That was Young Jang, but his cohort, so to speak, on the musculoskeletal disease panel, Christy is here, as well as Camillo Ricordi from the diabetes panel, and Andrew here from the panel that happened in here. So I would like, as in the previous afternoons, to ask each of the participants to stand up and speak for maybe 6 or 8 minutes on their own topic, essentially summarizing what they said in the concurrent sessions, but for the benefit of those who were in a different session, and perhaps putting it in to some extent in the context of other stuff that they've heard. And I would expect that to take roughly half of our time, following which I will move on to orchestrating a discussion about various topics in relation to all of that, first of all between just the 4 of us, and then opening it up to the audience. So I'm going to go in the order that's in the program, which I believe means that we start with Christy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. It's been really stimulating to be here. I'm getting lots of new perspectives. And I started off my talk previously saying that I am probably a lot different than most of you here, because I'm the person that if you create a technology or you have a pathway that you're interested in, or you have something that you have in a dish that you're trying out, I'm the person that then you would then give it to so I could put it into my animals and so that we could do in vivo testing on it. So I'm generally and globally interested in behavior and function in animals, and more specifically, I'm interested in it in the context of what many people refer to as sarcopenia, or loss of skeletal muscle that occurs with aging. One huge consequence of this is a loss of physical performance, which leads to overt disability in older people, and ultimately causes them loss in quality of life. Over the years, people have thought that you may equate the loss of skeletal muscle mass with the loss of strength and disability, and this was a linear type formula. But over the years, what we found is that even though you can show there's a relationship between strength and declining muscle mass, it only explains about 50% of the relationship. Therefore, there are other things outside a loss of skeletal muscle mass that may contribute to loss of function, weakness, and ultimately disability. Some of those factors are probably neurological and centrally mediated, so there's been more attention given to that biological mechanism. But it's very complicated, as you can imagine, because it almost involves the entire physiology of the skeletal muscle system and the central nervous system. So it's difficult sometimes to get out exactly what your target should be when you're treating people and aged people, and everyone who ages becomes sarcopenic to some extent. So when you talk about trying to develop target compounds, the FDA actually says, well, we won't make sarcopenia, we won't give it an indication, we won't make it a disease because we really can't define it and we don't understand its relationship to function. So what many people have done is try to redefine sarcopenia based on different levels of skeletal muscle mass and different levels of function that include mobility measures and strength measures. And there's been several consensus groups across Europe and across the United States who have tried to come together. And one consensus that they've come to is that muscle mass doesn't completely define what sarcopenia is, even though sarcopenia means loss of skeletal muscle mass. So what people are trying to do instead is to use behavior as a potential tool in order to probe the physiology so that we can understand what is going on. So for example, a person may have loss of mobility, but they have preserved grip strength. So if you had a compound, you might treat that individual different than an individual has preserved mobility and impaired strength. So this differential diagnosis approach is maybe the way to go in trying to figure out and using behavior as a tool to inform the physiology and then create these target compounds or interventions that target stem cells, et cetera. The other part of my talk was just talking about animal models of this process, and that my lab and others have, which is a missing link in translation, because we have all this physiology, we know genetics, we know so much about the aging process in animals, but we don't, and we can give compounds, but we oftentimes don't take that extra step and see if what the compound, the intervention that we're doing is actually having a functional effect in the animal. And so that's what my lab, and as I said, other of my collaborators do. And what we found is that we can show similar relationships between declining function, loss of muscle mass in our animals, and we can test compounds, and we can get some of the same results. So for example, in humans, you can give testosterone, and you can get increases in muscle mass without a concomitant increase in function. We see the same thing with some of our animals with different interventions that we use. One in particular, rapamycin, that most people have probably heard of, which is a longevity expanding drug. We're very interested in this because we think there are some instances where you might give someone a drug that has been tested in animals and it enhances longevity, but it has nothing to do with enhancing what we call their health span or the remaining quality of life that they have while they're alive. So we make those distinctions. And with rapamycin, for example, we gave it to our animals. We had lots of the good effects that people see when they give rapamycin, but we did not see any changes in grip strength. So we did not see any change in a measure of functional status. And if you actually look at the literature in mice, and there's an anecdotal small trial in older humans, there's no change in grip strength with rapamycin either. So we have to be cautious in terms of how we're going to use these interventions. Even though we're changing physiology, we may not change function, and that goes against kind of everything I believe in terms of wanting to make people live longer, but you want them healthier while they're longer. So in the end, redefining sarcopenia may be important. What the actual contributors to that are there different kind of forms of sarcopenia? Do we need different names? For example, dynapenia has been suggested as a name for muscle weakness. We all need to keep talking to each other, and animal models are good for testing out these ideas. Thank you.
Andrew.
Okay, hi. My name is Andrew Martello. I represent a 15-year research program into why patients do or don't take medicines. Medicines don't work in patients that don't take them, right? WHO suggests 30 to 50% of patients prescribed a medicine for long-term conditions aren't taking them as prescribed, and that represents a huge fault line in modern medicine. Okay, so what we're doing within our group is trying to understand how we can reduce the challenges that patients are having engaging with some of these very innovative treatments. We put most of it, or our thesis is around behavior. So the rate limiting step between an effective treatment and an optimal outcome is the behavior. The behavior at least two human beings, actually. So the clinician, are they prescribing it effectively? Are they prescribing to guidelines? And the patients, do they actually take it? And the biggest challenge we have is that we provide information to patients post-prescription as a one-size-fits-all treatment. So we need to start thinking much earlier on in the drug development pathway how we can start to apply the same rigor and the same structure as we do to developing the innovation as we do to actually supporting the patient to engage with it. So a lot of work that we've been doing is the development of tools, validated tools, 5 or 6 profiling questionnaires, which will enable us, and it does enable us, to understand at an individual level your barriers, your facilitators, what's going to stop you from engaging fully with that medicine, because everything I've heard today is around reducing the uncertainty, okay? And the uncertainty from a healthcare payer's perspective is that we're going to reimburse this medicine, but we know that 30 to 50% won't engage with it fully, and it's a waste of an innovation. So the work that we're doing is currently sort of beyond the drug development process. So it's when patients are prescribed a medicine, what can we do to support them to take it? But individuals will weigh up and do their own risk-benefit analysis. It's what we call the necessity concerns framework, okay? So every individual that engages with a medical treatment will view it in the sense of two salient beliefs. How much do I need it? Or more likely, how much can I get away with not taking? Versus the concerns I have. And throughout all our studies, I don't have my slides, but I can show you that a majority of patients harbour erroneous, mistaken beliefs about health. They're representations of illness. They're representations of how that medication fits within the illness. And if there's not a natural fit, you're looking at a non-adherent patient. So a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to mitigate that risk, trying to develop in parallel with the innovative technology, an innovative solution that provides a product plus or an innovation plus support program for the patient. The digital environment, we heard from our keynote speaker this morning, the digital health behavior fused with medicines-related behavior. If we can fuse these things together and start to create an environment where every individual at point of prescription receives a care package that optimizes their engagement with treatment, I think we're going to see real-world efficacy that we currently see in studies and a bigger return on all of our investment, the patient, the clinician, the company, the payer, because currently we lack innovative collaborations. And some of these new studies that we've been talking about where there is a more collaborative approach will lead to a more optimal health outcome. Thank you.
Many thanks, Andrew. Camillo, please.
Good afternoon. In our session, we address the challenge of diabetes and biologic replacement strategies that now are moving in clinical trials to address this challenge. As you know, diabetes affects some 350 million people worldwide, projected to become over 500 million in the next couple of decades, and is also, in economic terms, is representing a budget issue for healthcare of $256 billion a year in the United States alone. So it's around 10% of the healthcare budget, which is now staggering 2,500 million or 2.5 trillion or 18% of the GDP of United States that we spend in healthcare. So I mention this because it's a big problem, not just because of the size of the suffering and the economic impact, but also because in front of this epidemic and increased cost that is bringing healthcare together with other degenerative disease conditions to unsustainability, we also have a raising of the regulatory block and other obstacles to translation in clinical trials, so that I was just informed by a colleague and friend from a major multinational company that now Novartis is thought to be particularly efficient in bringing drugs to market because their cost is only $4 billion average per new molecular entity in less than 10-year time, while Pfizer and others are at the $7.4 billion average development. So if the trend is to raise the bar of regulatory imposition to cellular therapies and biologic replacement therapy to the same level of drugs, I think we will have a very hard time ahead of us and will be really challenging. So nevertheless, like the islet transplantation field, replacing insulin-producing cells in the most severe cases of diabetes is moving forward. Canada approved the procedure, Switzerland, Australia, some England, and some region in Italy, and we just completed the phase 3 trial, FDA phase 3 trial in United States that lasted over 7 years and 75 million for an NIH-sponsored budget. So we're very eager to see if this will move towards a biological license application and eventually reimbursement of this procedure for the most severe cases of type 1 diabetes in which you can justify use of immunosuppression, so it's limited to less than 5% of patients with type 1 diabetes right now. The future is also of great interest because we're seeing the first tolerance induction protocols being tested clinically, the first phase 1-2 trial that are ongoing right now, together with the first application of embryonic stem cells, the ViaCyte trial that just got approval last week from FDA to move to the first phase 1-2 trial. So, and you see that for the first time, major corporation entering the space and getting interest in cellular therapy also for immunomodulation and tolerance induction. So you have Novartis entering with the Susan Ilstadt facilitating cell technology that was licensed worldwide. You have Neostem that acquired the entire IP package from BD for expanded regulatory T cells, Mesoblast with the MSC trials also for immunomodulation. And I think we will hear much more emerging in the next several months or year ahead of us. Of course, this has tremendous implication for all disease conditions, not just diabetes. If you can now perform organ, tissue, and cellular therapies without immunosuppression, will open enormous potential and possibilities. And right now, our key challenge, I direct the Diabetes Research Institute at the University of Miami, but we have a network, a federation of 24 diabetes centers worldwide, from China to Europe to Canada and elsewhere, because our major challenge is that now the cost of translational research and clinical research in United States is prohibitive. For us to do a one islet transplant here costs between $250,000 and $300,000. To do it in Canada costs less than $25,000. To do it in China less than 10. So there are differences also if you're planning your strategy for translational clinical research and you have limited funding on what you can do in United States besides the delay imposed by regulatory bar being raised constantly. So it's a very promising time and a very exciting time for some of the development with the awareness of major challenges that may limit the applicability of what we're doing. Thank you.
The topics that I thought would be worth discussing up here over the next maybe 15 minutes are actually ones that have been present more or less conspicuously throughout the whole meeting. They certainly came up on the first morning. And the first one I want to start with is the question of disease. There's an enormous amount of heat and perhaps not very much light generated by conversations along the lines of, is aging a disease? And conversely, one might say, something I like to say actually is, are the so-called diseases of old age actually diseases in a useful, meaningful sense? Can we actually think in terms of curing them the way we think of curing infections and so on? I tend to lean to the idea that we should just avoid using the word disease at all, and perhaps also the word aging, but that's perhaps a little bit overstating the case. However, the point I want to ask the panel here is, we know, and indeed it's been discussed today, that the question of what is perceived as a disease or what is perceived as a defined condition determines very strongly the way in which it is regulated, in a way in which treatments for it might be taken forward through the regulatory process. I would like to explore whether it also has a deleterious, perhaps, effect, certainly an effect, on how we actually do the earlier stages, the investigation of potential therapies. It seems to me that, well, it certainly came out in the session on musculoskeletal disease, which we could have just called, musculoskeletal, not disease, that there is a difference. So I wonder if anyone up here would like to offer some thoughts on whether we could somehow improve the process of right all the way from bench to bedside, really, by having perhaps a more carefully thought out, a more rational, less semantic understanding of the relationship between aging and disease.
Well, just from a semantic perspective, how a patient responds to an illness threat and how that disease is perceived will have a lot to do with how the scientific and medical community position what that disease currently is. So from the patient's perspective, finding a way of communicating the diseases of aging in a way that is in a way that they can understand and a way that they can see a natural fit between the innovation that we're creating for the diseases of aging and their perceptions of actually what the illness is, so they see a natural fit between the two, would be a really good thing to do, I think.
Well, I just wonder, even for most diseases, there's some kind of continuum that disease falls along. So so I gave the example of we can't get an FDA-approved drug for sarcopenia because there's no definition for sarcopenia, but you have a definition for high blood pressure. We know what those cutoffs are, and if you're over 120 over 80, then you're considered to have high blood pressure, and the doctor can check the box, and you can get a blood pressure lowering medication, and we've solved your blood pressure problem by doing that. But there's probably many other things going on, and that's just one place you're taking blood pressure. I mean, there's you could have pulmonary hypertension, you could have kidney hypertension. You don't know where in the system that hypertension is necessarily coming from when you measure it out here as a blood pressure. So I think probably we need to start thinking about diseases like we think about aging. They involve multiple systems, just because and that blood pressure is going to affect if it's coming from your kidney, it still changes. It's still going to affect your heart, your cognition. It's going to affect you in a very global way. So until we approach a problem holistically like that, as I said, maybe like we approach aging, then maybe we're not going to be giving optimal treatments to people anyway for any kind of condition that they're having.
Well, I consider pretty much life as a terminal disease, and aging is like a symptom, but what you can have is like a accelerated aging condition, and how you live like less than 30 years, or the 140 years target, or the 700 years target of Peter in the keynote address is very interesting, because you can affect, and prevention, someone mentioned in the debate in a previous session, on how little focus has been given to prevention, and prevention of accelerated aging is a typical good example, because if you think diabetes is a disease of accelerated aging, you shorten the lifespan up to 1/3, but it's also the prototype of inflammatory disease condition, so that now you see neurodegenerative disease condition have a base of inflammatory subclinical effect, and many other disease conditions. So if you start seeing how the diet and the evolution of our diet and lifestyle has contributed to the spread and epidemics of this degenerative disease condition, there is a lot that could be done also on the prevention side of the equation, not just on the cellular therapy and biologic.
Yes, I'm going to come to selling prevention in a second, but actually beforehand I wanted to explore a little more something that a couple of you just said with regard to this whole business of the continuum, the continuous progression of these chronic diseases. I think that perhaps it's even worse than has been said so far, because not only do we have to cross the barrier, the hurdle of getting some kind of agreed definition within the field of how bad some continuous process, some quantitative readout needs to be called a condition, which might be defined simply in terms of where you are on the spectrum, or in terms of what it is seen to mean in terms of translation into function. But also, you've got to cope with changes in that. Changes by age, so for example, something that would be considered worthy of treatment for someone at the age of 40 might be considered average and therefore not worthy of treatment at the age of 70 if it goes downhill with age. And this, of course, is a societal problem. You could call it ageism, really. And secondly, of course, science changes. If one wants to try to define the cutoff that constitutes having a condition in terms of its functional consequences, then additional data will come along that may alter what decision one would make there. And in order to actually implement that updated decision, one's got to go back to the regulators and have the whole conversation again. it's a big challenge for people like Richard Barker and others here who are trying to take forward adaptive licensing and other increased sophistication on the regulatory side of things to try to educate the regulators and the people that the regulators have to listen to actually put in place a system that has the flexibility that's needed, which is a lot of flexibility. And maybe we'll come back to that later on in questions. But yes, now I want to move on to prevention. And really this comes centrally to Andrew, though I definitely want everyone to comment. Adherence is a big problem in general, but it seems to me that preventative medicine is a particularly hard sell. Essentially, I mean, at bottom line, because especially for any medicine that is even slightly new and experimental, the perceived cost-benefit ratio is really challenging when people aren't yet sick. They think that there's going to be a problem. So I wonder whether there's anything that we can do to get, especially in the case of aging and the age-related diseases, which are essentially very hard to challenge when they've progressed a long way. If we can, if you see any way of educating the public to be more rational about it and think longer term.
It's a really interesting point. So, representations of illness, we develop through our lives certain stereotypes and prototypes of illness. So, when we're younger and we develop an acute illness, we know we're sick because we feel sick, and then we take a medicine and we feel better. And then that's thrown into disarray when we develop a long-term chronic condition, potentially at a stage where we're not symptomatic, and told to take a treatment for the rest of our lives that makes us feel dreadful. And that's a huge challenge. So the work that we're doing, and specifically in diabetes around improving self-management, if you look at self-management as a preventative step, is again around adaptive representation, so adapting the individual's representation of the current disease. I mean, we work a lot with groups of diabetes patients, and they don't see their condition as anything other than something to do with sugar. So it's around not just information, but education. There's something that we call the information action gap. And we need to change the beliefs of the general public and patients in general. And there's only really two ways that you can do that. You can provide information that concurs with their current belief system. They're likely to follow out the instruction, or that changes it. And as I said in the previous session, we have a saying at UCL that behavior change isn't rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. So understanding the individual is key in this process, and understanding actually a great example. So we're working, and again, apologies to the others in the previous group, we're working with a new innovation for polycystic kidney disease. We're asking patients to take it in their early 20s. It has a terrible side effect profile, if I'm being honest, and you have to drink 7 liters of water a day. Okay, we did a challenge, nobody achieved it. What's the benefit of taking this medicine? You go towards dialysis probably 5 years later than what you would do if you didn't take the treatment. Now, the patient community is screaming for it. The regulators have put in a risk management plan that makes it almost impossible to prescribe. But what we've got to do is educate patients in their 20s that if they take this, the benefit comes in 40 years' time. And if anyone's got any bright ideas on that, rather than questions, we'll take that as well. So, yeah.
Christy?
It sounds like behavioral economics is in order for that one. Because really, it's true, because how can you, or what can you do in the short term to reinforce their behavior? Yeah. Because I really like, I didn't hear your full talk or anything, but I like this concept, because I think it's the same for, some of the only preventative anti-aging or anti-sarcopenic interventions, which is exercise. Yeah. And we all know how adherent people are to exercise programs. And, a lot of times when you go to NIA now and you try to propose an exercise grant, they say, no, thank you. Clinicians say people don't do it. So we're not even going to fund this stuff anymore. So, having, more research or more efforts put towards doing behavioral changes and reinforcing people for those positive behaviors seems like a really good place to put some money.
And I think that information and education are key, clearly, but There is also information and education of physicians and healthcare workers. And one of the biggest mystification and misinformation in the area of diabetes is that while diet and lifestyle can prevent 50% of type 2 diabetes, in type 1, the autoimmune form that affects mainly children and in young age, diet doesn't have any role, but they're immediately identified that your son became diabetic, so it means he's spending too much time in front of the computer and eating too many cakes and sugar. And there are groups now trying to change the name of type 1 diabetes and type 2 to differentiate the two disease conditions, in which in one you have a role of prevention and in the other you're dealing with an autoimmune disease condition. But the other challenge is, like as you mentioned, like to educate someone to start prevention when he's a teenager is very tough, because like I remember when I was racing downhill skiing and they told me if you don't stop racing your back will be destroyed by age 30. You say, who cares? At age 30 you're dead anyway. It's the attitude that you have when you're 18 sometimes. And we see it often with type 1 kids, with teenagers, that if you say you have to do intensive insulin therapy and monitoring because otherwise by age 40 or 50 you may have retinopathy, is very tough, because some actually don't take insulin to lose weight, or there are all these side effects in the specific age group may have as a challenge, but awareness and education could change that.
Thank you, yes. So I see there are already people at the microphones, but I just wanted to touch on one other theme before we go to the audience. One thing we've tried to do with this conference is, as you've all seen, to be very multidisciplinary about it. First of all, to bring people together who work on aging with people who work on specific things that are normally called specific age-related diseases, but also to bring together people all the way along the spectrum from bench to bedside, people who are working very much on the, so we say, the PhDs and the MDs. And this we've done largely because we feel it doesn't happen nearly enough across the whole spectrum of disease research and development. So I'm wondering whether any of you have any comments about that, about how we might be able to improve and enhance the quantity and quality of communication between the biomedical researchers and the more clinically oriented sector of the community, and how much difference you think it would make, how effective that might be in accelerating the bench-to-bedside transition.
Well, I can take a shot, because we developed this model, we developed a hybrid model between academic and industry, targeting, like if your mission is to get to a cure in the fastest, most efficient way possible, how should you structure your institute or center? And in our model is at all levels, you mix clinical scientists, preclinical large animal models, small animal and basic scientists, by topic or theme, whether it's tolerance or stem cells or differentiation, cellular therapies. And I think that is a key, because you have a feedback is not only bench to bedside, but is also bed to bench when something doesn't work, and constantly discussing and having cross-fertilization at different level. I think that is a key component of a successful.
Do you see it in your institution actually having an effect? You know, do you think that this feedback loop between the two communities is actually working faster as a result of it?
Yeah, I think, well, we still didn't find the cure, so the jury is still out, but I see it, for example, it works preventing close alley of research. Like if you start working with the regulatory people, the clinical people, if you start testing a molecule that will never see the light of a clinical trial, or if you start having a feedback that is a different path, like traditionally in academic institution where your performance indicator are only how many grants do you produce, how much indirect cost you generate, and other factors. You're encouraged, I remember when I was at Washington University, say if you find a mouse model that works, stick to it, because if you have renewal of your NIH grant for other 5 years, then you get tuition remission, you get tenure, etc. But nobody says, what did you do to actually get closer to a cure for that disease condition in the past 3 years, and what are you going to do in the next 3 years? So bringing clinical and basic science together, I think, can help that.
Yeah, Yeah, at our institute, one of the problems is if you try to recruit geriatricians from med students, because as a specialty, it's not that exciting. I think it's exciting, but not everybody thinks it's the sexiest, route to go into as far as treatment. You want to be a surgeon, you want to be an oncologist. So we have to do a better job, I think, of going in and recruiting people who are oncologists, people who are endocrinologists into the aging field, and that's what we try to do at our center. We target MDs who are not necessarily doing aging research. They don't think they're doing aging research, but they actually are. So we target them, and through we have a Pepper Center that we can bring people in that do different things. We function around a theme of maintaining quality of life in older people as they age. And then we can bring people in, and MDs specifically, we really target them to be a part of our program. I think and I think we've been successful. We've created cognitive programs, we've created physical disability programs, we've created, we just got a big P50 center grant to look at sepsis in the elderly after trauma. So, but the only rate limiting factor after that is that giving these MDs time to actually get in the lab and do the work they need to do and work with the basic researchers. And in academia, I don't see how that's going to change anytime soon. People just need more money to buy out their clinical time, I guess, in order to do it.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think it's time to go to the audience. Go ahead, please.
So just some related points. One is osteoporosis is, I think, recognized as disease, the bone loss. I'm not quite sure how come it's easier to get that classified and have markers for that and not sarcopenia, because they seem somewhat related. And then around the issue of consistent levels of large number of the biomarkers, that medical tricorder, the large number of sensors to be able to get more in-depth readings would then, if it's AV stepping on a scale to get a deeper readout, then you'd be able to track populations better and be able to do cross comparisons to perhaps get that kind of information.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think with osteoporosis, fractures was the thing that everyone agreed on. And so they could go from there.
You mean the fact that there's a sudden outcome,
Yeah,
as opposed
exactly.
to something so low-key?
That's right. Like incidence of fractures increases at this age, so this is when we're going to start looking for it. We'll start screening for it. If you have these particular, we can do bone mineral density on you, and that's predictive of a fracture. And so, that maybe that's going to come with sarcopenia, but it hasn't come yet. Now, I think I saw about the tricorder. That'd be interesting for every disease that's multifactorial.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Martello. I applaud your work with SOS, and I'm a clinically active family physician. I just want to make 2 points. First of all, the adherence studies that I like the best are the ones that show that not taking a medicine is a conscious decision on the part of the patient. And we have this bias where the doctor is always right and the patient is always wrong. And many millions of dollars have been spent by the pharmaceutical industry throwing education at patients at almost no effect. We have a system problem. Most medical visits are hurried, they're brief. Studies have shown that a patient leaves a doctor's office with an average of 3 unanswered questions. And when patients have unanswered questions, they're less likely to go fill a prescription. Kaiser has reduced this significantly by creating a platform of communication and care with the patient through Health Connect, where the patient's unanswered questions are always addressed, and it's a constantly available dialogue, and they found that their adherence goes way up and the control of the disease goes way up. So I think a system of using a digital platform of communication between the patient and the caregivers will go a long way. Focused on this. But second point I want to make is I'm in a medical practice where we actually demonstrated over time that we reversed more than 50% of our diabetics, and I discontinue more drugs than I prescribe because we use intense lifestyle modification. Type 1 diabetics, you're going to cure, Dr. Ricardo, but 95% of diabetics are type 2 diabetes, and the vast majority of them don't need to have the disease. Most of them don't know that. I look at a type 2 diabetic and say, would you like to get rid of this disease? And they go, what do you mean? And I go, you don't have to be a type 2 diabetic. Well, what are you talking about? Nobody's ever said that to me. And I said, if you get your body fat down to an optimal level, get rid of all this truncal body fat that's, poisoning your metabolic system, you may not be a type 2 diabetic. And even if you are, it'll be mild compared to what it is now. And they buy into that because they actually have a lifestyle pathway to rid themselves of the disease. And I think we fail in doing that. If we have a drug-oriented cartel, was mentioned yesterday, and if we just, we're now using gluten-free diets and are amazed at how many people are walking away from disease. We have an internist colleague who's really our leader, who takes no drugs for ankylosing spondylitis because he eats religiously an anti-inflammatory diet. And using these approaches, talk about aging. If you get people's body fat down to optimal levels, their lifespan and their health span is going to be a lot longer.
Comments?
No, I completely agree. As I mentioned, over 50% of type 2 can be prevented by diet, and we actually ran the DPP trial. It was a large NIH study that showed for the first time lifestyle intervention be superior to metformin in prevention of type 2 diabetes. And I like specifically the anti-inflammatory diet story because it's beyond metabolic syndrome, but is also, besides the gluten-free diet, if you look at the omega-6, omega-3 ratio and how worrisome is the fact that in the United States, if you take Japan as the model where they have a ratio of 1.5 and they have the longest healthy lifespan on earth, and then you see the American population where the average is 18, which is the same index of inflammation that you have in diabetes. So practically just eating a traditional American diet and fast food, French fries, and high glycemic index is all things that contribute to inflammation. It's amazing how this synergize, because if you take a high linoleic acid diet with refined vegetable oils, but you don't have a high glycemic index and a high insulin peak, you have much less effect, because once insulin activates the desaturase, then you have conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid, and the whole chain is an amplification loop. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity to do good also for aging and anti-aging by controlling diet with anti-inflammatory intervention.
Fully agree with your points, actually. It usually comes as a huge revelation to clinicians that patients actually intentionally choose not to take their medication. So, as a behavior non-adherence, we look at it as in two parts, interrelated behaviors really. So intentional non-adherence, and that's down to motivation and attitude. And then the other side of the spectrum, which is unintentional, capacity, resources, forgetting. And unfortunately, a lot of the interventions historically have focused on, well, just send them a text message and remind them to take it, and they'll take it. And unfortunately, that's failed. So, yeah. And in terms of your point around the clinician, concordance between clinician and patient, we're trialing iPads in waiting rooms at the moment, which send belief psychological profiles directly to the electronic medical record in preparation for the consultation to try and get over some of these unanswered questions.
Fantastic.
So this bounces off of Aubrey's first question and also some of the points you raised in your presentation, Dr. Carter, and I guess I'm really addressing the question to you. Mm-hmm. So part of the reason why FDA is being recalcitrant about turning sarcopenia into a disease indication is because, it's a somewhat amorphous definition. On the other hand, we do treat people for hyperlipidemia and hypertension on the basis that there's a causal pathway and a clinical predictive power between those risk factors for, heart attacks, strokes, and so forth. So, granted that you can say, certainly you can say predictive power, and you can probably argue causal connection, and granted that it's a much more directly testable phenomena, when you look at things like grip strength or gait speed,
could you envision a situation where you could get instead those treated as we currently treat hypertension or hypercholesterolemia and say, we want therapies that specifically address these particular dysfunctions because we know they predict future disability, and then develop medicines for those, which is probably the better way to develop them anyway, rather than trying to treat, sarcopenia as a global, neuromuscular dysfunctional mess.
I think, so the last paper from that biomarkers consortium had in it that differential diagnosis slide that I showed. So basically, so you have a loss of function. Do you have a loss of muscle mass? No. Then go over here. But do you have low grip strength? And yes. And then so it's something else besides sarcopenia. So I think we could get to the point where we could say, if you could show that there is a certain amount of muscle mass loss and it's associated with weakness, then maybe it's efficacious to try to treat that muscle loss. And that is the cause of your loss of function. If not, perhaps it's neurological, and then maybe those are other treatments that we have to pursue in order to do that. I don't know, that it's a tricky question. Can we just come up with something for gait speed? Because it could be that you have gait speed reductions along both of those chains, but you would still require something that's very different to treat it for that person.
Well, I think perhaps Michael's point was, or maybe should have been, that that this has regulatory potential. In other words, that one might actually not try to define something like sarcopenia or adenopenia as a condition that would be defined by the FDA and for which drugs would be available, but rather one would actually define grip strength or gait speed as the condition, and then these other things would these other things would be markers for predisposition to the condition.
Sure, I think they try to do that. I mean, frailty may be the same way. They can identify 5 things that determine frailty, and that's it.
But frailty is way too late in the game.
It's a syndrome. Yes, I understand that, but I guess the marketing of it is the way. So I'd be interested to see how you would actually package that and present it. I think it's a good point.
So with respect to the drug adherence, it was treated largely as an educational problem. And I would like to bring up the possibility that it's also partly a trust problem, and that the trust problem is partly a valid trust problem. We've all been told, all grew up with calories in, calories out, fully determines weight, and high salt causes heart disease, and all carbohydrates are the same, all lipids are the same, and a huge number of other preventative health type advice, which we have, as a society, changed our position on. And if you go back over history, you have Woody Allen making fun of that tendency in the movie Sleeper 40, 50 years ago. So it's not like we haven't known for a long time that health advice tends to not be beneficial. So it seems like a well-informed patient who was being told that they could harm their health as detected by their experience of life now for a 5-year delay in the statistically likely central tendency of onset of a cystic kidney disorder and dialysis 40 years down the road would probably be making a mistake to take that drug in the same way that I would be making a mistake to get the knee surgery that I had recommended half a lifetime ago based on everything I've learned about knee surgery since then. So from an education perspective, I worry both that educating people of things with confidence is the only way to get them to listen, and educating things with confidence inevitably in the long term just produces cynicism. And also that there's a finite amount of education that people can receive. So whenever you advocate people learning one thing, you implicitly have to be advocating it in contrast to knowing something else. And I also noticed one great educational fact during this talk, which was that moving to Canada and doing your research there is associated with a 90 to 93% reduction in research expenses, as well as well-known increases in life expectancy, reductions in death rate from all sorts of causes.
Sad about the weather.
Right, and this is a very educated population for whom that incredibly relevant lifestyle, health, and well-being intervention is available. It's easy to explain the mechanisms. And yet I don't think, although I deeply wish we could, I doubt we're going to get widespread adherence within the scientific community to the intervention of moving to Canada. If anyone has any suggestions how we could, please speak to me. I would like that very much.
Any comments?
Thoughts?
At least that was amusing.
I think that there is at times healthy skepticism around the information that we provide to patients, and I think that there are a lot of causes for that. I think one of the fundamental challenges is the pharmaceutical industry and the amount of information that they're imparting on patients, and whether that fits within a marketing strategy or a genuine, let's improve the health of the patient strategy. So I think that things like industry standards, well-respected sort of websites and content is really important. We talk about the context, to optimize an intervention, the context of that intervention needs to be received, it needs to be trusted, and it needs to come from a source, ideally from the clinician, but there's a few rate-limiting steps there as well if the clinician doesn't have the time, the information, or the training to impart an intervention that's actually going to work.
So Nuremberg for Big Pharma?
Say again?
So Nuremberg for Big Pharma?
No comment.
So I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the session in about 5 minutes, so can we just have very concise questions, please?
Okay, quickly, one point in terms of prevention. The terminology bench to bedside assumes you're so sick you're in bed. If it was bench to bicycle, might be a better approach. Second, if I can suggest one policy idea. When we are all wearing those devices that are keeping track of our health, if we were to monitor and give a 5% tax incentive for having a healthy lifestyle, would be paying us and we could be correlated.
Yeah, I'd love to know what the panelists think about that.
Do we have time?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So, the quantified self movement. So we've been following that with keen interest, and I'm still following it 3 months in. But waning my adherence is struggling. But there's a lot of data to suggest that this isn't an enduring behaviour change technique, and transferring this technology to the non-tech savvy is the biggest challenge. Trying to get my wife to even pick up an iPhone is challenging enough. So, we need to understand how to translate digital technology for health to the general population.
Christy, Camillo, anything about that? Comments?
No.
Okay.
Real quick, one of the things that got me to go to the gym more often was the gym offered a introduction to a drawing for going every so months. So often I was wondering if that could work for getting people to take their drug medicine, is giving them some sort of verifiable way if they took it, therefore they're entered into a drawing.
Yeah. So you talk about incentivizing patients to adhere. Yeah, there's been multiple strategies to demonstrate that. There's some ethical challenges if it's potentially financially based. You kind of want a patient to stop taking a medicine if it's having an adverse reaction with them. So, there's been a lot of success around incentivizing. It's got to be in the right context. Gamification in the younger patients is a wonderful technique, and there's been some really good examples of how that works. An industry that are doing it very well at the moment is, in the UK anyway, health insurance. So you can get points for going to the gym and doing certain runs, and you start to get benefits there, and that seems to work. I just think we need to have a really long, hard think about it in relation to medicine.
Just to comment on your first point, Aubrey, how do you define aging? And I think it'll have vast ramifications. If you define it as a disease process, it's probably more susceptible to intellectual property interventions, which can be good because it can be incentive for investment. If you define it more as a natural process, it's probably more in the domain of free speech and crowdsourcing. So big definitional differences there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll invite my colleagues to comment in a second, but my own personal view on this is that the decision whether to call aging a disease or to define it as a disease process and so on is only the first step in the process, and it can only be, we can only answer that question whether it would be a good thing to do if we can see the rest of the joining of the dots all the way to actual action. So I think that really comes back rather strongly to the issue that came up about 10 minutes ago of whether it makes sense from a regulatory perspective to define something like sarcopenia or donopenia as a condition that you can have drugs approved for, or whether one might do better to go one step down the stream and define something like grip strength or gait speed as the condition that you have drugs for. I don't think there's a simple answer, yes, no answer to any of those questions. I think we need to look very closely at the whole network of decision-making processes and influences of those decisions and incentives for those decisions in order to understand really what the right way to go is.
I agree.
Any comments from the rest of you?
I would just say, right, if you do that, because I've been sitting here thinking about it, I mean, these are predictors, right? So you can't go and train your grip strength and improve your outcomes necessarily, right? So so we have to understand how we're using these measures and why, and in order to get where you and Michael are suggesting.
Last question.
I was thinking that maybe you can use the fact that exercise is not considered medicine or treatment, and just circumvent the FDA and say, okay, well, you don't want to regulate it, and then we can just go straight to the people and go straight to, say, insurance companies and say, okay, you are covered for the risk. We can show that you get economic benefit, and so get a program that's funded by them that's like participation in Canada or other places, and then also go to other countries that are more nanny state inclined to do it, prove it out there, and then say, lower medical costs, want to try it, that kind of thing.
Carrot or stick, as I would call it. So obviously the work that we do is very much built around incentivizing patients to take positive health decisions, self-manage their disease. But I completely understand the challenges that stand between that and actual success. There's technologies that exist now. Some of you may be aware of Proteus technology, the chip in the pill that records when you take your tablet, and pretty much everything else as well. And again, we've got to understand how these technologies are going to be used. If they're perceived to be a stick, i.e. adherence rates of 85%, or we won't reimburse and things like that. We have to think long and hard about the long-term repercussions. I'm a big fan of carrot and stick.
All right, well, I think that seems like a fine place for us to conclude. We will now move directly to the final event of this awesome conference. I think I can say that because I didn't really organize it this time. And that will be the session chaired by SENS Research Foundation's CEO, Mike Cope, whom I don't immediately see. There you are, good. All right. So I'll let him take it from here. Thank you very much to all of my panelists.